Welcome to the Loins of History. My name's Collin, and I'm joined by my co-host Jay. And here at the Loins of History, we're going to connect the events of the past to the events of today. If you remember from last week's episode on Chinese-U.S. relations, we talked at length about containment and where containment all began, and especially around the U.S. and China. And before that, we got into the loss of China. So really, we're in this period of the 1950s. And within containment, the U.S. policy against the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China was to contain communism and prevent the spread of it. And for today's episode, we're going to apply that to Taiwan. And Taiwan has been a flashpoint of Chinese and U.S. relations over the past 70 years, really since the end of the Chinese Civil War. And what we're going to talk about today specifically is some of these incidents and crises within the Strait of Taiwan. Now, the U.S. very nearly went to war with China over Taiwan. And we're going to take a look at some of the effects, the lasting effects that has occurred because of those policy decisions made by Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles, as well as the 7th Fleet that was stationed there. So really exciting episode, going to cover a lot of history that I really didn't know a lot about, but it's a great research topic, and I think it's very applicable today, especially with some of the reports on war games that have come out regarding a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan in 2026, which we'll cover. And we'll use that as the connection point between some of these previous crises and what might happen today if China ever did decide to invade Taiwan. So with that being said, Jay, can you give us just a quick synopsis and talk us through what the first crisis of the Taiwan Strait was?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Colin, for that introduction. So we've got one key takeaway for this episode, and that key takeaway is U.S. policy beginning in 1950 was to defend Taiwan militarily in the same way that we defended South Korea during the Korean War. So a lot of times I have friends and here in the United States that there's a lot of confusion anytime a government official, President Biden has remarked on I think at least 2 or 3 different occasions about defending a random island in the East and South China Sea. And it's like, why is the United States talking about, potentially going to war over this seemingly random island that we have seemingly no actual interest in?
Or why it was such a big deal that Nancy Pelosi took a flight into Taiwan, why that was such a hot topic, and why right. I think the Chinese military was even on alert at that point to try and intimidate the U.S.
That's right. Why doesn't the United States care about Madagascar? That's an even bigger island.
They don't produce semiconductors and microchips.
That's right. There's plenty of reasons why, folks, and we're going to talk about it here on the Loins of History. So there's a ton of history between Taiwan, China, and the United States. So really up until this point, this is episode 13 in our U.S. and China relations series. And we've been focusing on a lot of history between China and the U.S. Taiwan, this seemingly random island off the coast, has not played a major role in the history between China and the United States until now. So our key takeaway here is really just trying to say, Americans, generally speaking, know about the Korean War. If you live in a halfway distant or halfway decent high school district, you probably heard about the Korean War. You may not know anything about it. I suspect, however, the majority of people that listen to this podcast are history nerds. So you guys probably know a lot more than the average American about the Korean War. But the key takeaway is intended, hey, this is the point in time in which the United States started caring about Taiwan, and we cared about it in the same way that we cared about South Korea. Colin talked about containment in our last episode and brought it up again just now. And we absolutely the U.S. government were concerned about keeping communism and the CCP out of Taiwan in the same way that we were concerned about keeping the CCP or the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, out of South Korea.
Yeah, and to your point, it's kind of interesting talking about why do we care about this seemingly unimportant island? Well, I think it was up until the Treaty of San Francisco, where Japan ceded control or nominal control, is called Formosa. So it wasn't even Taiwan; it was Formosa. It was just an island off the coast. So, Jay, can you give us a quick summary of what happened during the first crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in 1954. Immediately after we, the United States and the United Nations, sign an armistice with Korea and North Korea and China. In 1954, in late summer, the CCP starts getting squirrely. So Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, the KMT, had retreated to the island of Taiwan. However, they still held some very tiny islands that are right up against the coast of China, and still held the island of Hainan, which is the small island right on the southern edge of China, pretty close to Vietnam. KMT still held that island, still held several islands along the Chinese coast. Well, in 1954, the CCP starts getting squirrely, and they start shelling one of the islands, Kinmen, that's really close to China, in between Taiwan and the Fujian province. And then they launched amphibious assaults on some other islands. This led to limited skirmishes breaking out, and due to Harry Truman's policy of, hey, we're going to defend these areas that are coming under communist attack, in 1954, Republican President Eisenhower kind of followed Truman's policy, and he ordered the U.S. Navy, the Seventh Fleet, into the Taiwan Strait, and we had ourselves here a Mexican standoff. And we essentially, between the United States and communist China, we had pistols drawn, and it's like that meme in The Office where Dwight and
Pam and Michael are all sitting there,
are all pointing finger guns at one another. They're not actually pointing guns. But maybe it wasn't quite this way, because we weren't pointing guns at the Taiwanese or the KMT. But nevertheless, we were kind of in this standoff situation. Well, the U.S., in very U.S. fashion, went very high and to the right. And the U.S. Joint Chiefs, recommended to President Eisenhower that we do preemptive nuclear strikes on China.
We were ready to roll.
We were ready to really crank this thing up a notch.
I think some of the hawks at the time also wanted to, quote, unleash Shanghai Shek to try and almost... Right. Because their goal, it's funny, looking at the Taiwanese, I think at the time they were 1.3 million nationalist refugees that fled to the island of Formosa and came to Taiwan. Mm-hmm. They would have been outnumbered 500 to 1 at this point. Yeah. And so unleashing them to try and retake China would have been
not a good idea.
No, I'm not an odds guy. I'm not a betting man, but I would not take that bet. But there were hawks within the administration that were we need to use tactical nukes, and we need to unleash Chiang Kai-shek. And I think part of that was due to the fact that, like we talked about last week, we underestimated the Chinese military, and we did not I think a lot of people saw a threat of the Chinese, so we wanted to try and destabilize the Chinese in, almost a proactive, aggressive form of containment. Just my thought right there.
Yeah, the way that putting Seventh Fleet in the Strait was sold to the American public was because there were a lot of communist sympathizers in the United States. It wasn't vogue. This is the height of the Red Scare, but nevertheless, there were some leftist sympathizers in the United States, and the way that it was sold was, hey, we're keeping Mao out of Taiwan, but we're also keeping the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek out of China as well. It felt very much like hey, we're just trying to keep the peace type deal. But we all knew who the aggressor was, and it wasn't Taiwan. It wasn't the KMT.
So I do want to make a point about this. In 1950, going back to the Korean conflict, and like I just said, China got involved. China got involved essentially with a green light from Joseph Stalin and the USSR. I think we've talked about this before. Mao and Stalin were very close. They had a much tighter relationship. The USSR they had very close ties with China. They had a mutual agreement of friendship, and I can't remember the exact name of it, but I mentioned it last week. They had a pact, basically, of cooperation and mutual friendship. So at this point in China, they're still kind of a new nation. They were not going to act necessarily without support from the USSR. By 1954, Joseph Stalin had died a year before, and there was actually this power crisis going on in the Soviet Union for like 3 years, where Khrushchev was consolidating. He was kind of Stalin's heir, if you will. But there was a power struggle for like 3 years where him and two other Soviet politicians, and I'll look up the name in just a second because I just had this thought. They were competing for power for like 3 years. So the USSR took a very passive stance in this crisis. So they were not backing the Chinese. And as soon as the 7th Fleet showed up and there were talks of tactical nuclear strikes, the USSR absolutely backed down and was not going to get involved or back a Chinese aggressive posture to invade Taiwan to, quote, liberate the Taiwanese. I think that's important to note.
Well, hang on. I read that they did not back down, that they sent a statement to the US that said, if you attack China, we will get involved. Where's that at?
That's part of their mutual. That is part of their mutual.
Yes.
But they were not.
At this point in time, they still had a mutual defense treaty.
They did have a mutual defense treaty, but they were not going to back China's aggressive posture.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right.
I guess, let me clarify that. They were not going to back a Chinese attack of Taiwan. They would back the Chinese if the U.S. attacked. However, they were not going to get involved nor support a Chinese aggressive action like invading Taiwan. So I think Khrushchev at this point, it's interesting. We'll talk more about Khrushchev because he's going to come into play with some of these, with his relationship with Mao and some of the way he handled some of these crises. But I think he viewed it as he was more of a de-escalationist if you read on about him. And I don't think he or the Soviet Union really supported this, nor did they want to get into a war because China wanted to have Taiwan. That's how I should clarify it.
Yeah, and even Winston Churchill
contacted
the U.S. and was like, don't use nukes. So, there was a bunch of third parties that were trying to tell the U.S. to chill the freak out. What's funny, just anecdotally here, what's really funny is if you specifically look at the Joint Chiefs, all the way up until and through the first part of Vietnam, the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so for our listeners, the Joint Chiefs were the senior ranking military officials in each of the branches of the U.S. military. So Air Force was created in 1947, Marine Corps, Army, Navy, and they formed the Joint Chiefs. From this time through Vietnam, they were all former World War II guys. And they're like, anytime something popped off, there are multiple different instances where when something happens, they were like, nuke them. It was this very much go-to. Was it Curtis LeMay was part of the Joint Chiefs during the early 60s, getting involved in Vietnam. And there was a lot of beef between him and McNamara because it was hey, we need to try to, keep North Vietnam from, not getting too crazy. And LeMay just constantly was like, nuke him.
Just nuke. It's
all right, guys, chill out.
It kind of reminds me of George C. Scott's character on Dr. Strangelove, where he's obsessed with a nuclear bomb and he ends up that's kind of the image I get at this point. And I think that's what the whole Dr. Strangelove was kind of characterizing that. But yeah, and by the way, I had in my notes somewhere, it was Khrushchev, Melenkov, and Bulganin were the three that were kind of in this little power struggle. And that's a totally different topic for those 3 years succeeding Stalin. However, just for your own notes, it was Bulganin and Melenkov.
Fun history fact. there was not a peaceful transfer of power after Stalin's
No,
death.
people kind of underestimate that. Like they think it's like one dictator in Russia in the Soviet Union, but that is absolutely not how it happens. And there was pretty brutal repressions of like political opposition within the USSR that occurred very frequently, and we only found out about till much later. However, anyway, so
there's so many comments. I want to talk about how Vladimir Putin came into power, but it's completely off topic. We need to get back to China and Taiwan.
Talk about chaos is a ladder. That's how he got into power. Anyway, that's a little Peter Baelish little figure.
Yeltsin named Putin his successor 6 months prior to Yeltsin actually retiring. And the reason why Yeltsin did that was because he knew that power struggles in Russia are pretty crazy. And he was trying to preemptively Putin's my guy. Putin's going to be in power. Everybody chill the freak out.
Well, it's more interesting is how here it's another sidebar, but how we
can't help ourselves.
How Putin, who went from kind of I don't want to call him like a middle manager in the KGB, but he was not like this supreme, high-powered executive in the private sector. He was not in like a high-ranking general in the military or the KGB. He was only like at an equivalent of like a director level.
It was his time in St. Petersburg. So he was like the right-hand man of the mayor of St. Petersburg. And he did such a good job wheeling and dealing because wheeling and dealing, that was when the Russia was, transitioning its economy during the 90s.
They called it shock therapy.
Yeah, from centrally planned socialist government-owned economy to private ownership. Well, if you can imagine, when you have tons of government assets, if you're in any kind of position to decide who ends up becoming the private owner of all these former government assets, you can make a lot of friends that way. Like, okay, Boris, you're now the owner of the formerly known Leningrad Steel Company. Here you go, Boris. And next time I want you to do something, Boris, you frickin' remember how you became the owner of the Leningrad Steel Company.
By the way, a lot of them did.
And that was literally how Vladimir Putin did it.
It's kind of, I just had this other thought.
We are getting so far off topic right now.
We talk about shock therapy, kind of this transition from centrally planned communism to a private capitalist economy. What's kind of like a reverse Great Leap Forward in a way, because a Great Leap Forward was always packaged as this transition, to an egalitarian communist society from this pre-industrial agrarian society. Neither of them work very well, and they always have very, very dire consequences. We're going to get into that.
Both of them were terrible for their economy. Yeah,
we're going to get into that next week. Let's bring it back to these crises of the Taiwan Strait.
Let's bring it back.
So, Jay, we talked about the first crisis. Can you talk about what happened afterward? What the aftermath of the first crisis was?
Yeah,
and then transition that.
Thank you, Colin. So the aftermath of this crisis was, we were at the U.S. was using a policy of nuclear brinkmanship to get the CCP to chill out. Well, the U.S. kind of, it wasn't exactly a good look, but it did work. So it did work in the sense that as soon as this nuclear brinkmanship was playing out, the Chinese absolutely backed down. Zhou Enlai, the premier, kind of like the number 2 guy behind Mao, he gave this speech and he was like, hey, we don't really want to fight the United States like that. That wouldn't work out well for anybody. While the Joint Chiefs are like, you're dang right, it ain't going to work out well for anybody. So China backed down, and there were 2 different kind of unilateral, not treaties, but positions. So the U.S. and Taiwan signed a mutual defense treaty that lasted up until 1980, by the way. But we signed a mutual defense treaty. It included language very similar to NATO Article 5 that basically said, if one member of this treaty gets attacked, the other one will militarily, respond and get involved. That's Article 5 for the NATO treaty. That language is included. We were mutual treaty allies with the KMT. It's probably also helpful to start to start referring to the KMT and the Taiwanese as the Republic of China, the ROC.
Mm-hmm.
Only because, like, that's for the remainder of this podcast. We essentially begin referring to Taiwan as a separate country, as the Republic of China, in contrast to the PRC, the People's Republic of China.
I'm glad you said that.
Which is the communist sub.
Yeah, because we're not really talking about political parties. We're talking about separate country. Well, depends on, they're one country. It's just who has the claim to that whole country. That.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. So go ahead.
I think it's important to note, like you brought up NATO Article 5. We had these mutual defense acts. We had signed these with several other Asian countries around, like Japan, the Philippines. We had signed several of these, and we had even created, I mentioned it last week, like CIATO, which is kind of this, a more or a less power, a less involved NATO for the Pacific. The whole purpose of it was, again, going back to containment, was really to combat the Chinese in the Pacific and the spread of communism. And one of the issues and difficulties we had with it was on the European front with NATO, you had a definitive line. You had the Iron Curtain, and you had one real threat, the USSR. Well, here you had the Chinese, but you had all these vulnerable countries, like we'll get into, Vietnam, you had Korea, you had some of these other countries where communism could break out very quickly in a revolution. So we had to think kind of strategically. And I think I've heard it referred to as like a hub and a spoke based on, the separation of Japan being an island, Taiwan being an island, Korea being a peninsula. And they're kind of spread out over this wide area with vulnerable areas all intertwined. So with this hub and spoke method and all of these mutual defense treaties that we signed, we would basically be able to react to a outbreak of communism at any given point. And a lot of that was designed around containing specifically China. So that ends the first crisis. Basically Zhou Enlai says, we don't want to fight. What happens next?
So after we scared the crap out of the CCP created something called the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. They took the origin of these 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. They were first created in 1954 when the CCP was resolving border disputes with India. However, they took these principles and they applied them in 1954 to Taiwan, and then later they wrote them into the constitution of the PRC. So let me read these 5 principles here because they're very helpful for understanding how the CCP thinks about sovereignty in their own rights today. So 5 principles. 1, mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. 2, mutual non-aggression. 3, mutual non-interference in each other's affairs. 4, equality and cooperation for mutual benefit. And 5, peaceful coexistence. So they later, after 1904, they later wrote them into their own constitution. So China, communist China, takes these 5 principles very seriously. Now, the reason why I'm saying these are applicable for today is when China talks to the U.S. about Taiwan, they refer to these 5 principles. 1, mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity. Hey, U.S., Taiwan is a part of China. You have to respect our territorial integrity. 2, mutual non-aggression. U.S., don't attack us because we are resolving an internal affair. 3, non-interference in each other's affairs. Hey, U.S., Taiwan is a part of China. Therefore, don't interfere in our internal affairs. And 4 and 5 are, hey, we need, mutual benefit and peaceful coexistence. So it's like China's smart. So what they did to kind of resolve this nuclear brinkmanship that was going on in 1954 was they were like, hey, peaceful coexistence, like we're fine. And to an American, it's like, oh, cool. CCP, they're not going to attack Taiwan anymore. This is great. what they just did was they laid the foundation for a future like legal and a talking point, a narrative that allows them to attack Taiwan.
Yeah. And you know what? Like you said the words, like, this is an internal affair.
Mm-hmm.
In order to enter into like international relations, or two countries to have, cooperation relations, I'm blanking on like a technical term here, but you have to recognize the PRC as China, not the ROC. This comes into play later we talked about, okay, well, this mutual defense agreement existed until 1980. That's the reason it stopped, because it correlates to a date where we started recognizing the PRC vice the ROC. And it's important because within the Chinese, within what the PRC wants is you have to recognize them, their claim. If you want to enter into relations, if you want to have trade agreements, if you want to do all these things with us, you have to recognize us and our claim.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just, so this is when I was doing research for this episode. This is why this kind of stuff is fascinating to me, because here we are in 1954, where again, we had literally just, fought a war on the Korean Peninsula against the Chinese. Here we are again, 1 year after the armistice, nukes pointed at one another. I think, Colin, don't let me tell lies, but I think China successfully tested their first nuclear weapon. Was it in the late 50s or was it in the early 60s?
It was the early 60s, but I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the effect or consequences of this crisis was that Mao, being very smart, Mao said, okay, we see the U.S. has nukes and they're willing to use them on us.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go
we
fund.
Don't have nukes.
We do not have nuclear weapons. I want to take money and go fund it. And he used that within his party to gain support and to fund their own nuclear weapons program. And within 10 years, I assume that they had, it's a foregone conclusion that they had support from the Soviets, who already had a nuke. But within 10 years of this, they were testing their own nuclear weapon. So, we look at, I guess we could ask the question, like, was it the right decision to send the Seventh Fleet? I'm going to say yes, it was the right decision to send the Seventh Fleet. However, threatening a nuclear war over this is probably not the best decision, because Mao just turned around and was like, well, they're going to use nukes, we're going to get nukes. And then suddenly now they're a nuclear power in the 60s. So that's not good. But
yeah. So
it's easy to armchair quarterback it from 70 years later. It's so easy, because to be honest, I could knowing what we know now, knowing that the Soviet Union there was some political turmoil after Stalin died, and they did not have an appetite to fight the United States at this point, especially with nuclear weapons. Our nuclear weapons program was further ahead at that point. Knowing that, and knowing that the Chinese probably would have no answer other than just like they did in Korea, just sending human waves at us, we probably could have used tactical nukes and just overthrown the Chinese. It could have worked. That is the most radical idea that you could have.
Yeah. I definitely don't think we could have overthrown the CCP. I mean, we talked about it several episodes ago. The CCP had the support of the people. Like, the people wanted the CCP.
And if we detonated a nuke,
probably would keep them.
These Americans are really
change
evil.
Their mind.
But
they'd be like, "Oh gosh, Mao, save us."
I guess that's the point. It's kind of like, well, we were threatening a full measure, but we weren't going to take it, so it ended up long term not being. I feel like anytime you're going to threaten a nuclear weapon, you need to be okay with the consequences of either not using it or using it. And the not using it was giving the CCP a reason to fund a nuclear weapons program, and using it would be, well, we just killed millions of people, and now they even hate us even more. We've proven to be the evil imperialists that they claim that we are.
Yep. Okay, so I am personally torn on was putting Seventh Fleet in the right call. The right call. Okay. Because so let's put this in the context of two competing schools of international relations. There's the realist school and there's the idealist school, all right? The idealist school takes principles like sovereignty and self-determination and peaceful coexistence, right? And it says, hey, we need to act in a way that upholds these principles, etc. That school of thought would probably say, yes, we need to defend Taiwan. They are their own country. Like, nobody has a right to attack another country. They, like, hey, we're not going to say who is the rightful sovereign over China. We're just going to say, hey, you guys need to figure it out in a diplomatic, in a civilized fashion, not through the force of arms, right? The realist school could probably be broken down at least into two different schools of thought, right? One realist school of thought could say, yes, we needed to defend Taiwan because the CCP is a competitor for power. The CCP is a hostile power. The CCP is not friendly to the United States. Therefore, we need to oppose them at every turn. Therefore, we should have, we should then and should now defend Taiwan from China. The other realist school of thought could probably say something like, no, we don't need to defend China or defend Taiwan. Taiwan in 1954, Taiwan was a sparsely populated island. The KMT was still fighting off tribes on the island of Taiwan. It's a fascinating aspect of Taiwanese history, but Taiwan was not this like it was very much the frontier. And there were like native non-Han Chinese tribes still living in Taiwan at this time. So it was like, this island is not in U.S. national interest here.
They were not building semiconductors at this point.
Of which they are now. They're the world's leading producer of semiconductors. It was probably the smartest thing they ever did. Anyway, the point being is that, like, what would have changed in the global, like, geopolitical landscape if China controls Taiwan? I think there's an argument to be made in 1954, nothing would have changed. Unlike Korea, where South Korea was a way more robust economy, a way more area of strategic interest to the United States. And I think a unified communist Korea would have made things look drastically different, as opposed to this massive country known as the People's Republic of China controlling an island off of its coast. You know what I mean? Like, it's not comparable. But yet, recalling back our first key takeaway here, the U.S. decided to defend China in the same way that the U.S. decided to defend the KMT in Taiwan in the same way that we decided to defend South Korea. So we had the same policy, but yet, again, from this realist school of thought, they're not the same country. It's not the same strategic interest. The communist Chinese had already taken over all of China, save this, one big island off the side. Like, it's not the same. Whereas in Korea, it was half the country, right? If there was this massive, if continental China itself was split into two, then yeah, an argument could be made. But like, we're talking about an island off the coast. So I know that sounds really cold and heartless. This is why Jay, am personally torn over these two things, because there isn't an easy answer. I think all three, the one idealist and the two different realist schools of thought, like, there's compelling arguments for each of them. There's good reasons to make any of those three U.S. policy. And it is not an easy answer on which one they should be. And the U.S. for the last several years, or several decades rather, has been trying to balance all three of them.
Jay, that's actually, you're right. It's tough between those three schools of thought. I understand that there's compelling arguments to be made on all three, but I guess as we're running on this episode, there's a second crisis that occurred a few years later. I know it was a little bit different. There was a heavier concentration of military force. Can you summarize that one real quick for us? And we could talk about some of the aftermath and then tie that into today.
Yeah. So just to make sure that we're covering all relevant topics here, there was a second Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958. And that crisis was actually, conventionally speaking, a little bit more intense than the first one. So there was actually a fairly significant air-to-air conflict between Taiwan, the US, and China. Like several dozen aircraft were shot down. We actually stationed pretty significant air assets on the island of Taiwan. Both Air Force and Marine Corps squadrons were put on Taiwan.
First time we used the AIM-9 Sidewinder just as like a kind of a technical, like an air-to-air missile, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And AIM-9 would remain in the U.S. inventory for quite some time. But an AIM-9, just for our listeners, you can think of it as a heat-seeking missile. So that was one of the first and early heat-seeking missiles. In technical parlance, that's an IR or an infrared missile, but in pop culture terminology, it's a heat-seeking missile.
It's got heat seekers. Yeah, that's a simple.
That's the Hollywood version of it.
We'll keep it at a Hollywood level, but yeah, right. Yeah, with that air to air, it was actually pretty decisively used because the Taiwanese Air Force was able to use it, and they actually shot down quite a few MiGs. I think they had a pretty substantial air-to-air kill ratio, or if you play Call of Duty, a kill-death ratio in the air. They shot down quite a few planes. However, Chinese and the Soviets were able to get a hold of an AIM-9 and reverse engineer it, unfortunately.
Well, so what's funny is that AIM-9, Colin, you want to tell them how they got a hold of it?
Yeah, it hit a plane and it didn't blow up. It just got stuck
lodged in the future. It got lodged in the fuselage of another aircraft.
So it worked. So the quote heat-seeking capabilities worked. It just didn't detonate. But
yeah, can you imagine being the dude that landed with that airplane? Like, I imagine, that scene in Airplane where the guy's like, it's just sweat pouring off of his head as he's trying to land the airplane.
He's looking back like, my God, there's a missile sticking out of my fuselage.
He is going to tell that story as long as he lived. Is probably like, I got shot in the air by a missile and survived. Because I would imagine, there's an element of kinetic energy. Like when you're flying MiGs are not that big. They're not like 747s flying around out there. And all of a sudden this missile hits you so hard that it gets like jammed in your fuselage. Like that would not have been
Bro, those missiles are traveling like twice as fast as the aircraft is. And the aircraft's coming close. The aircraft was becoming close to Mach 1, and those missiles are traveling like over the sound barrier, and it hits you. So yeah, the kinetic energy would be significant, and then the rattling and the fact that the plane just didn't come apart is a miracle.
Right. Yeah, there's so many that's wild. That's how they were able to get a hold of that AIM-9 is lodged in the fuselage.
A little tidbit of history. But anyway, so do you just want to walk through some of the significant events of that crisis besides us losing an AIM-9 and shooting down a bunch of MiGs?
Yeah. I mean, so it was during this crisis that the PRC actually seized Hainan, which was controlled by the KMT. Hainan is, again, that small, or that island that's right off the southern coast, kind of in between China and North Vietnam. Eisenhower, again, kind of mobilized the military forces. We put a bunch of squadrons on Taiwan. The CCP shelled Kinmen again and would continue to shell different places.
So can you tell us about the shelling and the agreement was with the shelling?
Yeah. So long story short, the CCP and the KMT kind of arrived at this gentleman's agreement that they would continue to shell this island only on even number days.
They were very specific.
In a very specific place. So like the KMT guys would basically like kind of go underground at a predetermined time they would shell the island and then they would come out and it'd be gravy. So like nobody died. As a matter of fact, I don't recall at what point, but the shelling, they replaced the explosives with propaganda leaflets.
I can imagine like these bombs going off and it's just a bunch of leaflets. It's just
Yeah.
it's comical. Bang. It's almost like the gun bang. That's what they're shooting at each other.
And that went on until 79, I believe. I think.
Yeah.
This like gentleman's agreement shelling, I think it went on until 1979. So that's a long time to be doing that. At the end of the day, the second Taiwan Strait crisis kind of receives less attention than the first and the third. The third would occur during the 90s, but we'll get there when we get to the 90s.
Yeah, we got a long way to go.
Yeah, because there weren't really any major like policy changes that came out of the second Taiwan Strait crisis. Like we'd already signed this mutual defense treaty. We weren't really threatening the use of nuclear weapons. Like there was a more conventional flavor to the second Taiwan Strait crisis. And as I think we'll get into our next episode potentially, this is around the time when Mao decided to begin its Great Leap Forward.
Yeah,
which took a lot of internal CCP attention away from Taiwan and towards their own economy and how they were about to jack it up.
a couple thoughts on that. Like, I think the policy shift was less about the U.S. sending nukes, but then B being the ones that were going to bear the brunt of the Chinese aggression, and it shifted to the Taiwanese. Like at this point, the Taiwanese had occupied the island for a few years, had established their own somewhat cohesive military at the time, but I think the policy shifted to the Taiwanese now are going to be able to be a first response defense against Chinese aggression. That's why we gave them the AIM-9. We were selling them military aircraft that they were going to use to fight the MiGs, and obviously they would never be able to defeat the Chinese on their own, but they would at least be able to put up a measured defense, and that kind of became the policy moving forward. Well, the policy modified to incorporate that into the strategy.
Right.
And then also, if you look at it, the first crisis we mentioned, the Russians were we don't really want to go to war with the U.S. This time they took a stronger stance with the Chinese, and the Chinese then were emboldened because Khrushchev had solidified power. And even though he and Mao did not see eye to eye at all, as a matter of fact, that was part of Mao's purpose in going into the Great Leap Forward was actually to pass the Russians or the Soviets, excuse me. He claimed it was, we're going to catch up to Britain, we're going to pass the US, but really it was like, we're going to be better communists than the fake communist Khrushchev and his soft policies. Yeah. So they took a more allied, ironically, that even though Mao and Khrushchev didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things, the Russian or the Soviets, I keep saying Russians, but really the Soviets were going to back the Chinese. Yeah, 6 of one, half dozen the other.
They're still Russians.
They were. Russia was the dominant country within the Soviet Union. Anyway, so I think that's why the Chinese felt a little bolder, and actual, military actions occurred in a conventional sense. So I think the other point I would kind of bring up is obviously there's been 3 actual crises within the Strait of Taiwan. This is something that's important because it's not going to go away so long as there's a Taiwan, a PRC and an ROC. So long as there's 2 Chinas basically and not 1 China, this is not going to go away. It's going to resolve itself one way or another. As a matter of fact, the Center for Strategic, the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, did a war game recently where they took they created a scenario where the Chinese and the CCP actually invaded Taiwan in the year 2026 and, went through all these scenarios, I think about 24 different times. And they wanted to study what would happen. And basically the Chinese would lose. However, it would be at what they called a grave cost and heavy casualties to the U.S. And this is all like declassified. You can go on and Google this study, and it's fascinating. I recommend you do. It's about 160 pages or so of the report. But basically, they find that the Taiwanese, like I mentioned, that the Taiwanese have to bear the brunt. Basically, the entire defeat of China in this scenario is the entire victory conditions are predicated on the Taiwanese not immediately surrendering.
Yeah, honestly, it's kind of crazy. I personally believe that in the same way that France was never able in 1,000 years to successfully launch a amphibious landing on Great Britain.
Not since
I think in the
1066. And mind
That's
you, in
right.
1066, the Saxons had already fought a battle against the Vikings. So they had to march, and that was in the north of England. And then they got lucky that it was, I can't remember who the leader. Sorry, folks. It's been a while since I've studied the Battle of Hastings, but basically the Saxon leader took an arrow to the eye, and then the Saxons lost courage. They had already fought a battle against the Vikings, and they beat them at Stamford Bridge, had to march all the way back across England to go meet the Normans in the south of England and fight them. And it was really only because he took an arrow in the eye and died that they lost.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a miracle that even happened with the Norman invasion in 1066.
Yeah, if I was China, I would just look at the last 1,000 years of global history, and that is if it doesn't matter how strong your military power is, you have to get super lucky to do a successful amphibious assault. And if the United States decides to get involved, it kind of doesn't even matter what that involvement looks like. You're not going to win. The CCP is not going to be able to successfully militarily invade Taiwan, even though it is so close to their country.
People don't realize that, I've heard this. I can't remember who the original quote's from. It might be like Napoleon or something. I don't know, Clausewitz. But, it's like amateurs talk tactics. What is it? Masters talk logistics or something like that. Professionals talk logistics, whatever. The ability to mass military power is incredibly difficult. And now throw in, you have to do it over sea, which, by the way, the United States has a bigger Navy than basically everybody in the world put together, and we have better strike capabilities. So, if you were to cross the Strait of Taiwan, you have to get all those troops either by air, which there's air defense systems. We have a better Air Force. We have more missiles. We can send planes in from Japan. We can all over the place. Or you have to send them by boat, which are slow moving in open water. We have a huge Navy. And that was actually what the CSIS, one of the things that they found was the Taiwanese just have to hold on long enough and not capitulate for the U.S. Basically, the U.S. and Japan and some of their other allies like the Aussies would get involved, basically to close in on the strait and start shooting. Because once they start getting involved, the invasion fizzles out because they just can't sustain operations long enough. Even if you land 500,000 troops on Taiwan, which is almost as big as the whole country, if you don't have enough bullets for them to keep shooting, I'm sorry, they're going to lose. And that's kind of the whole point of it.
Yeah. Look at why the Germans were never able to invade the UK during World War II was the Germans completely exhausted the Luftwaffe trying to gain air superiority over Great Britain because they didn't have the Navy to control the channel. So the Germans tried the approach of, hey, let's gain air superiority. Our air superiority will keep the Royal Navy ships away. And, that's what's going to allow us to send, limited transport ships over in Operation Sea Lion. That's what the Germans called the plan to invade the UK. They were never able to get air superiority. It was just too much. In the same way, I think that is essentially the Chinese strategy right now if they were to take over Taiwan, because to your point, Colin, their Navy is tiny. They don't have a very robust Navy. They have some limited capabilities. Go ahead.
We made a big deal about them creating an aircraft carrier. Do you know how many aircraft carriers the United States has? It's like 15 at least. We have destroyers. We have ships.
Freaking huge.
Yeah, they're floating cities. There's 6,000 people on them. We have subs that are no one knows other than that sub and like 3 people in the Pentagon know where they're at. We have aircraft carriers. We have destroyers. Our Navy is so big that it dwarfs everything else. So yes, we could send 7th Fleet to the Strait of Taiwan and we would outnumber their Navy basically and outgun them.
And while China would probably be able to bomb the crap out of Taiwan
easily, and that's
high explosives are really good for destroying military equipment and personnel. They are not good for subduing a people. The U.S. figured this out in Vietnam. Well, actually, I take that back. We didn't figure it out. We should have learned that lesson from Vietnam. Should have learned that lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Look at the Germans in Stalingrad. That city was reduced to nothing.
Yeah, if that people decides like you can bomb the daylights out of us and we're still not going to capitulate to you, there is nothing. Like, you have to put troops on the ground. I do not believe the CCP in a very long time will develop the naval capacity that will allow them to put sufficient troops on the ground in Taiwan to enable them to actually like occupy Taiwan. That's not going to happen for decades.
There's a book I recommend to our listeners to read if you want to kind of get an idea for how the CCP, the PRC, how they are going to fight the U.S. It's called Unrestricted Warfare. I want to say we may have mentioned this a while ago, but basically they're not, to your point, Jay, building a Navy takes decades. It's not something you can do overnight. You just can't. I don't care what your national will is. You just can't. You have to build the ships, and they're very complicated. You need supply. You need a lot of things in place just to build the ship. So they're going to wage war on other fronts primarily in order to erode the capability of our U.S. Navy. So that in Unrestricted Warfare, it's written by two Chinese colonels. I want to say in 1999 is when it came out.
Oh, yeah.
Studying. Yeah. They basically looked at the U.S. after Desert Storm, which we've pointed back to as like the zenith of U.S. power and hegemony compared to everyone else.
Yeah.
The Russians, the Chinese look at that and they're like, okay, well, in a conventional war, there's no way we can win. How do we win? It's through other means. So if if you're worried about a invasion of Taiwan, it's very real. You need to be ready for it. However, I would expect more conflict to occur in other domains, i.e. the economy, AI, cyber, things like that, which is occurring right now. So that's another, I'm getting off on a tangent, but that is one book recommendation.
It's actually really short too. But if I was China, because on some level I do empathize with the CCP. Like it's China. Taiwan has always been a part of China. Like, I completely get
they are
why
one people.
They want
the United States fought China. A war when somebody tried to leave, and we brought them back in forcibly.
Right. Like, the current U.S. policy in writing since the rapprochement during the Nixon administration in the 70s was we've articulated a one China policy. Not going to get too far into it because I'm sure we'll have a whole episode or two on it when the time comes. But like, we have a one China policy. So like, I get it. I get why the CCP wants and considers Taiwan a part of their country. The biggest mistake that the CCP, a huge geopolitical blunder by the CCP, was bringing Hong Kong peacefully back into their country and then completely crushing all opposition and dissent. Huge mistake, because what the CCP did when and they're currently like, Hong Kong used to be a great place to live. It sucks now. It is not. The CCP ruined Hong Kong. And all they did was they just showed the Taiwanese, look what we're going to do to you. There cannot be peaceful coexistence. There's a phrase, it's like one country, two administrations or something like that. They just lost that talking point. As long as Xi Jinping is in power, no one in Taiwan believes that there will be a one country, two administrations. They just lost that talking point. Therefore, the only way Taiwan is going to become a part of China is through the use of military force. And they created a lose-lose situation for everybody. So, Xi, if you're listening, which I'd actually be scared out of my mind if you were.
Well, one of his agents is listening, don't worry.
Oh,
somehow there's monitoring going on.
It's like, dude, you gotta cut that crap out. If you ever want to hope for a unified China, you need to bring back the like the traditional Chinese administrative position of nominal independence, and yet like Tibet had during the Qing. It's like, you're your own country, so to speak, but perform the kowtow to the emperor and we're cool. Like, let Taiwan have its own trade. Like, figure that out. I'm not smart enough to know exactly the nitty-gritty details. All I know was the crushing of opposition and dissent for Hong Kong was the wrong call, and it ended any prospects of peaceful reunification. So here we are. There will be a fourth Taiwan Strait crisis.
Oh,
when
100%.
it happens, I don't know.
There will.
And it's going to get ugly.
It will. Who knows if it'll turn into a full-blown war or kick off another international conflict, but we'll see. Jay, that was a great episode. A lot of talking points. Went off on a few different directions. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed it. Tangents, sometimes they're a lot of fun to go on. But this is a great episode. And I think it really tries these crises that we've talked about kind of capture the situation that has existed, honestly, really since 1954. And that is a precarious peace that is held up by potential or U.S. intervention, basically, and as well as their allies within the Strait of Taiwan. And it has created a flashpoint in international relations between the U.S. and China, and still will into the future, as we've seen with some of these war games, some of the talking points coming out of the current CCP administration, the Taiwanese government, and the United States as well. So it is going to continue to be something that is going to be covered. And Jay, you're right. There will be a fourth one. When it happens, we'll see. So listeners, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please give us some feedback. We always love reading some feedback, even if it's constructive in nature. We got some constructive criticism from someone that, hey, Ian, we'll try and cut back on some of the laughter a little bit. We don't want to let that get in the way of the information, but appreciate your reading.
You had a listener say that I cackled, which is probably true, but it is genuine, I promise.
If you know,
I
Jay,
don't feel nervous on my own podcast, I promise.
Jay and I go way back. He does like to laugh a lot. It's more, I would say, boisterous and jovial versus cackling. But anyway, we do appreciate that.
You,
5-star ratings are always appreciated. Helps the algorithm, helps us get the word out. Jay and I are on social media on basically any variation of Loins of History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Give us a like and a follow. We post some updates, just some fun pictures that kind of track along with, and tidbits of information that kind of tracks along with what we're talking about within the podcast series. So, give us a follow. And get the word out there. We appreciate the support, and we'll see you next week when we talk about the Great Leap Forward and getting into the Cultural Revolution in China. So that being said, have a great one.